And one of the reasons why it's there is that the culture that descended from what was always bourgeois patronage, in the sense that it was born with the city-states, that culture gradually became bankrupt in a sense. And when you talk about the prices you're talking about paintings being worth are the size of the GNP of most of the African states. That's what we're talking about. And that is clearly blasphemous. The thing about football is it gives all of these small economies a stake in the future. If they can just develop their artifice to that extent, they keep providing these geniuses, as they are called, these extraordinary phenomena, who pull out these amazing plays, which are not even in the rule book, which have never been predicted before, which are not part of the numbered play that goes on in, say, American football. We're actually looking at something here which we've got to understand. And it contains the two things. It contains this amazing beauty, that where people do things that ought to be impossible and that they can see. This is, you know, a good advertisement is one that you can watch 500 times and not be bored. They watch those goals 500 times and they are endlessly exhilarated by them. So that you have that thing there, but also the fact that they live in run-down, dead industrial cities, that they have really no hope, that they're not involved in any courageous enterprise, that there is no crusade, there is no war to fight, so that they make up pretend wars on the streets. Sure, it's hooliganism, but it's also some way of investing all of that surplus energy and fantasy that belongs to these people. I have been terrified by it on many occasions. I've been mobbed coming away from a football match and stuff because I'm on television and so forth. I'm as frightened of it as anybody else would be. I've been terrified in an underground station when I heard the fans coming down because I was going to end up on the live rail. But it is still something that I have got to understand. That's the aesthetics of where I'm coming from. Yep. In some ways, my interest in portable paintings is the purest nostalgia. And that's another reason why that's not consoling for me. So one of the things seeing as we are gathered here today, we mandarins, I think it would be something we could take on board, because whatever that idea was that wound up beauty and consolation, that's a place where they're to be found, where there is something that is perceived by many people as the purest, most disinterested beauty, and which actually makes lives that are basically hopeless, nasty, brutish, and much too long into something transcendent. So, and I have a friend who is a cell biologist. He's working at the cutting edge of the proteins involved in things that are going to be very important to all of us. He's working on the proteins involved in Alzheimer's and Parkinsonism. And I said to him the other day, it was a little while ago now, how did you feel when Cambridge United was promoted? And he said, I was walking on air. The discovery of a new protein did not make him walk on air. But the promotion of Cambridge United, which is a very tawdry team, did.
But I was thinking of Wim's first question when we all sat down together. And I can't imitate any accent, but I can hear the voice from Newcastle. The voice from Newcastle says, of course football isn't a matter of life and death. It's a bloody sight more important than that. And that is, every child in Newcastle knows that quotation, and that's one possible answer to your, what is the meaning, what is life worth living? And I want to borrow your phrase, we've got to take it on board. That's all I wanted to suggest. And how are we going to use our categories, our classical categories of judgment and insight with phenomena of this kind?
I think this cause, we don't need to be this pessimistic about the idea of art and the masses and our elitism. What else is going on out there in that computer world? And I'm very impressed by this, and this is something I'm not a fan of. But there is a huge culture of people designing art and exchanging art of a strange and peculiar kind out there. And this is not something that's being done by any means exclusively within universities or any other such thing. This is stuff that people are creating on their own. Now they've reached the point where they're making films, but they're also making drawings and paintings, and there's an astounding amount of this sort of thing going on. So in a way, I say that the mass culture is bubbling up its own new art. We perhaps don't participate in it, but and much of it's going to be impressive, and it's going to change the shape of things. by and large, they are not playing computer games. They're doing something altogether different, in some ways altogether more dangerous, but also, in many ways, altogether more hopeful.
Like all people in this world.
Like
I mean, they have
organising
power.
the
When they're on
anti-capitalist
the-
rights. Are you
when they're on-
talking about that? Because I think that is hopeful, I must say.
One thing that happens to them when they get on that thing is they have power. I mentioned this thing earlier about one of my thoughts on this business of consolation, we talked about it, is the thing that as a child, oftentimes you have the sense of powerlessness. You don't have power. Other people have power. They control your life. When they get on that machine and they get contacted into that net, they have power.
However, there is something that's really true, which I find very frightening, and that's that young people growing up today seem to get bored very quickly. They're so used to instant gratification. And the most perfect example came, I took a group of 4 students from England, 16 and 17, and they were picked out of their whole class. They came to Gombe National Park, this most exquisite place, one of the few places where you can be completely peaceful and where, if you so wish, beauty can console you. And I had them up on this peak which overlooks 2 valleys, and there they were. They'd never been to Africa. There wasn't a chimp visible, but there were baboons, there were monkeys leaping about in the trees, there were the butterflies and the birds, and even the little dung beetles rolling their balls of dung. I mean, surrounded by fascinating things. Their fares had been paid, and I suddenly noticed these 4 had disappeared. And I heard some sounds, and I went to look. They were sitting playing cards. And I mean, to me, that was so shocking. But these kids today, everything's got to be now. They've got virtual reality. They can't sit, they're not going to sit in front of one of these things like the cave journey we had back in there. They've got to click a button so that something happens quickly, and then they get bored in 5 seconds and they can click something else. And this is a very, very worrying thing. And if we're talking about beauty and consolation, I think maybe we need patience, interest, fascination, awe. We haven't mentioned the word awe. All these things are part and parcel of a set of values which I'm afraid, because I find that youngsters today are lacking. They're not coming into their education. The families are breaking up, and they seem to be changing in so many cases.
Well, you know, when I was talking before, when I was saying that we have to carry part of the blame for the present state of affairs, and you and I would both do what we could within certain limits. I have made my little films about the flora of southwestern Western Australia, which is being decimated even as I sit here, and about the dieback of the Aborigine communities in Utopia. And you and I would not waste this opportunity. But when you were talking then, this is an increasing nightmare that I have. I thought, would I have the right to ask Jane if she'd be prepared to set fire to herself by way of bringing to people's awareness what is going on? I think about Jan Palach. Do you remember, before the Velvet Revolution, the thing that galvanized the world and that made it impossible for Czechoslovakia to continue the way it was the suicide of a student, Jan Palach. Mm-hmm. And I sort of do deals with myself. I think, if they tell me I have ovarian cancer, then I'll do it. I'll do the Jan Palach. I'll burn myself and make sure that they know why I did it, and I'll do it in a very embarrassing place, just as Jan Palach did. People were asking me before why I said we are to blame, blah, 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 because it's a question of the perception of the alternatives. We're talking about the destruction forever of a part of the ecosphere, a very important part, we think, very rich. And we say we're doing what we can, but our perceptions of what we can do are reasonable. We're reasonable people. We would not set fire to ourselves. But the possibility is that without something unreasonable done on our part, this present erosion will simply continue. Well, what's needed now is martyrdom, not discussion, but martyrdom.
I don't believe for one second that if I were to martyr myself by setting fire to myself, which I won't, That's not the kind of person I am. I don't think that would make that much difference. And maybe this is very egoistical of me to say, but I think I can make more difference by doing what I'm doing now. So I never would do that. You can ask me if you like, but I shall say no.
Well, I'd say no too, but I would say no too. I think it probably would be unreasonable, but the situation is also unreasonable.
Yeah, I know, but I'm using just about every second of my life to do what I think is the best thing for me to do. And unless somebody can prove to me that I could do something different that would be better.
Well, for example, in the example that you gave of the activities of the school children in Shanghai, nothing they do will stop Shanghai being the most polluted city in the world and becoming more polluted hourly.
Well, I don't know. I don't think that's true. That's a very pessimistic view. It's not true. Think how London used to be. Think how the Thames used to be. Think how, this is one of the things I'm collecting up, these stories, these amazing stories of the resilience of nature. If we give her a chance, a helping hand, species that were on the very brink of extinction, that when people care and they protect in the wild, like the peregrine falcon, like the bald eagle, like the Seika antelope deer in Taiwan. Then there's the amazing story of the black robin in in the islands off New Zealand. They were down to 2 birds, 1 male, 1 female, breeding. It's like Adam and Eve. And they did this amazing, I won't go into it, they did this incredibly clever breeding program where they kept taking the eggs away and having them raised by other birds and then taking them back to the original parent because they're all tame like Galapagos. And the biologists were helping this original pair feed the babies. And they said it was just as though these 2 birds knew their role because she and her mate lived for 13 years instead of the normal 7. And there's actually a plaque to her on the Chatham Islands. There's now, I think it's 80 black robins divided into 5 different islands so that hopefully there's some genetic drift because of course they're genetically identical, but then so are cheetahs. So, there is hope. And I think the reason I was asked to start this program in China was because when I talked to the politicians there, I said, you have these horrible polluted cities. 9 of the 10 most polluted cities in the world are in China. But I said, I can remember London when people were talking about smogs, when they were wearing masks, when it was absolutely ghastly when you walked down the street and everything was black. It isn't like that anymore today. Los Angeles